We will go ahead and get started, and I'd love to just take a moment to introduce you all to the individuals that we're having as our guests today. Our first guest is Brandi Davis-Handy, and Brandi really started her career as a broadcast journalist, and that helped her to really begin to use storytelling and narrative to really make connections for people. And she's continued that into her corporate career. She currently serves as the Executive Vice President and Chief Marketing and Communications Officer for Project Lead the Way. Prior to joining Project Lead the Way, she served as a Vice President overseeing enterprise communications for One America Financial Partners. And she's also led communications teams at AES United States, Indianapolis Power and Light, and at the American Cancer Society. Brandi has been an active leader in the Central Indiana area, having served on a number of boards, including the 500 Festival. She's served with Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Central Indiana, Dress for Success, the Lynx Capital Corporation, and she's also a graduate of the Stanley K. Lacey Executive Leadership Series, one of my favorites. I'm an alum too. Brandi also has been recognized in numerous ways, but in particular with the Center for Leadership Development as a minority achiever in the area of communications. She was also named a Breakthrough Woman in Leadership Development by the National Coalition of 100 Black Women in 2018. And she got her BA in Mass Media Arts from Hampton University. So Brandi, we're happy to have you with us today. I'd also like to introduce to you all our second guest today, who is Thresette Briggs. Thresette is the Chief Performance Officer at Performance 3, which is a national leadership development firm. Performance 3 works with a number of global clients and really focuses on helping those companies to develop high-performing cultures. Now, before she launched this firm, she spent over 20 years in the corporate side of things, and she really helped to develop strategies for organizations and for leadership development in companies where they were looking at major transformations, turnarounds, and various transitions. Her National Women's Business Enterprise and her women-owned small business now partners with the leaders in many, many global companies in a number of different industries. She's a John Maxwell certified speaker, trainer, and coach. She's also a facilitator and an author. She's written numerous publications and a soon-to-be released book. So she also has a patent, which I find just incredibly amazing, for a specific coaching model to accelerate leadership development performance. And so that's kind of an unusual but pretty exciting thing. Maybe she'll tell us a little bit more about. She's received a number of honors from the Great Lakes Women's Business Council, the Evergreen Leadership Community Builder Award, and she's been a finalist for the Starkey Entrepreneurial Woman Award. I could go on and on about both of these ladies. They're so amazing. But right now I want to go ahead and get the conversation started and give you guys a little bit of an introduction to the actual topic today. So again, thank you everyone for your time. Thank you, Brandi and Thresette, for joining us. We titled today's talk the idea of moving the conversation from diversity and inclusion to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Now that word belonging is kind of a new addition for us at Borshoff, but in the work that we do in terms of employee engagement and diversity and inclusion communications, we have really seen that culture and a sense of belonging are truly critical to really sustaining a healthy organization. So I'm curious what you two think about this idea of belonging and really where that fits and what it looks like in the organizations that we're all a part of today. So to kind of kick us off, Brandi, would you like to start?
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for the introduction. Belonging is interesting because it's so key and crucial to diversity and inclusion, but it's a term that I think people are just now starting to hear more and more about. And Belonging is really about a feeling. Are you valued? Do you feel like you can show up as your true and authentic self? And I think the best way that I've heard it described is diversity is a fact. So, a lot of companies really get stuck in that first part of looking at their numbers, looking at what's the makeup of our leadership team, what's the broader makeup of our organization. And then you take it to the next step of inclusion, which is, are we inviting people to the table? Are we including people? But belonging is a feeling, and it's more about, and it's enforced by your culture, a culture that's built on intentional actions to make sure that people are seen and heard. And companies really are at the point, especially in kind of our current climate right now, of making the decision of how do we want people to show up? Do we want people to show up as their true and authentic selves? And if that's the case, then we have to put together truly intentional actions. And I think communicators have a big part and piece of this, of making sure that those employees are seen, heard, and celebrated. And, and I can tell you, I think you probably be hard to find someone who can't say that there hasn't been a time in their career that they've worked at a particular place where they felt like, before they got out the car or before they walked in the door, they had to put on some sort of mask. And that is exhausting. It's exhausting for the employee. And I think it's exhausting for the employer, because you're not going to get your 100% from that person. When I was reflecting and thinking about this conversation today, I was thinking about a couple examples just from my career. And one of which was when I had probably one of my first really large leadership roles. And I was on an all-male leadership team. And I remember sitting in leadership team meetings and hearing conversations and maybe slight comments or snickers around whether it was another female leader who was taking too much time off because her kids were sick. It was, oh, did you hear so-and-so is going on maternity leave? And I remember at that time, I made a conscious decision to not talk about my children in the workplace. I didn't want that to be looked at as a barrier of me being able to come in every day and do my job. But the reality is, me being a mom of 2 kids is a big part of who I am. And I shouldn't feel like I have to mask that in the workplace for people thinking that I'm not going to be able to do the job. So it's really feeling like you can be valued, that you can show up the way that you truly are, and that those around you are going to hear you and they're going to appreciate and embrace it.
That's really great. Thank you, Brandi. Thresette, what kind of thoughts do you have on this concept of belonging in the workplace?
Well, first of all, good morning, everyone, and thanks to Borshoff and definitely Catherine for this invite. This is a very, very passionate topic for me. And I could almost just say ditto to almost everything Brandi just said, because they're similar to a lot of my thoughts. But I'll start with this, and this echoes a little bit of what she said. We started with diversity in the workplace, which is a fact. We added inclusion, which is a choice. But then belonging is the most recent addition, and that's a feeling that you're safe enough to embrace your authentic self at work. So it's important to say first that belonging is an absolutely fundamental human need for our well-being and our happiness. And this definitely transfers into the work environment where we spend a great deal of our time. So if everyone on the call would reflect for a minute, I'm sure we could all think of one time when we felt we didn't belong. And that has powerful implications for the workplace because it directly impacts your ability to perform, which directly impacts the company or the organization. And belonging may be the more difficult one because it's a feeling to describe it through, but I think it's where we have the most opportunity to grow. And I can think of several times in I don't know when you plan to show the graphic about, the woman being interviewed, but I think that this just really describes the way I felt a lot of times when I was interviewing, and a lot of times the way I felt when I was in the corporate setting. Describe what you can bring to the company is what it says there at the bottom. Well, this person has to feel, and this is the way I felt, this person has to feel safe enough to say what she can bring to this company. And when she looks at that panel, it doesn't really feel safe. So when we don't have that safety to be our authentic self, starting in the interview process, the recruiting process, then we're already at a disadvantage. And years ago, when I got my diversity certification from SHRM, the words inclusion and belonging really were not in that conversation. But considering what's happening now in our nation and our world, it's really where I encourage leaders to start today with the topic of belonging, because When you address the fundamental human need of belonging, diversity and inclusion gain more commitment and therefore more traction toward equity. So that's what I would start with.
That's great. Thank you, Thresette. So I want to come back to something that you mentioned earlier about even starting in the hiring process. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of unconscious bias. It's something that we've all heard, that the term we've heard a lot about, even before just the last few weeks. But in the concept of unconscious bias, we understand that unconscious bias could potentially lead to favoritism. In particular, that's a tough thing for managers. They need to be very aware of that they're not showing favoritism in the workplace. But on the other hand, we also know from good leadership development that finding common ground is really helpful to establishing relationships with people and finding things that you have in common to start a relationship. How can you, on the surface, those two things feel a little bit like they might contradict each other. So how can we, as managers and as leaders and as role models, be sure that we are practicing good leadership development, practicing good opportunities to find common ground and to connect with people, because that's really the foundation of what we need to do, but do it in a way that we're not necessarily showing favoritism. How do we balance those two things? And Thresette, do you want to start?
Sure. You know, I think we can all agree that we have in common that we make mistakes. So that's definitely where we can start. So I think we all can take the pressure off of ourselves by recognizing that sometimes you just won't get it right. And, you know, I've done a lot of things over the years in understanding and reducing unconscious bias, accelerating development of diverse cultures. And I've worked with a lot of global leaders. There's also books, you know, like John Maxwell and, you know, Catherine, I know you are a JMTer as well, about failing forward, and sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. Those books were very powerful for me as a recovering perfectionist. And it really is so much easier when you understand that you're a continual work in progress. So with that in mind, I'll share just a couple of things that could help. I think we as leaders have to build trusting relationships with the people on our teams and who are our peers. And so when we make that occasional mistake, that gaffe that we know we're going to make because we are not perfect, it's more likely to be viewed as an unintended mistake and not so much an unconscious bias or something that you intended to do even, or maybe even an implicit bias. So you admit your mistakes, you apologize for them, and then you are accountable for improving them. You don't try to continually do that same thing. The other thing I would say is mindfulness and consistency of how we treat the people that we encounter each day. Because when I work with leaders, it's interesting, and I got permission to share this, but I helped one recently with an issue with one of her team members, and she was disengaging and she just really couldn't figure out why. So I facilitated a conversation with the both of them. And what I understood from the team member of why she felt, you know, her leader had an unconscious bias was, well, you know, because every morning she speaks to everyone but me. And so that really kind of shocked me. I try not to show it, but the reality for me is I don't even know if people have spoken to me sometimes in the morning until I get coffee. I don't even know if I can hear. So, you know, it was interesting, but it's an individual thing. So we have to really understand each of the people that we're with and build relationships with them so we can do the things we need to do around trying to balance unconscious bias. Apologize, admit when you're wrong, continually improve. And I think that will help that situation just be a whole lot better. Because things, when you don't do those types of things and people don't understand you and they don't have a relationship with you, that leads more, in my experience, to people having those feelings of not belonging.
That's great. Yeah, I know in my own experiences, as I've taken on more and more leadership, that I have to remember that people are always watching. And so people are always reading into what you as a leader do, good or bad. And so you just have to be very aware of the signals that you're putting off. And sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you get it wrong, and sometimes you don't even know what you're doing, you know. So you just have to kind of go with it and just do your best each day. And each day is a new day. Brandi, I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have on this, particularly because you've been in so many leadership positions, and how you balance this idea of, unconscious bias versus finding common ground, and being able to really make connections with people in a way that's consistent and helpful to furthering what you're trying to do in your organization.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that the first essential part is for everyone to understand and recognize that we all have blind spots and we really need to be aware of them. So bias lives within all of us. It's just human nature. And so once you acknowledge that and you can really figure out where your blind spots are or where those biases reside, then you can put in the mechanisms to control that. And so, I mean, as a leader, the one place I would say that I'm most focused on and where I think bias comes out to play in every organization is the hiring process. It's human nature. People, I think you think back to when you were in school, college, the friends that you're with now, you gravitate towards people that are like you. It's interesting, like even scrolling through this call right now, there's a number of people who are on my team now who have been in teams with me before. And I laugh because they'll tell you like the quickest way to bring these part is to say, let's go grab a coffee. And so I can't tell you how many times I walk down the hallway, they're like, hey, can I get you a coffee? Because that to me is saying they need a couple minutes with me to discuss something. And so as a leader, you've got to extend yourself and figure out what are those connection points within everyone on your team. And so it's not about how your team is going to connect with you. You need to understand what motivates them, what makes them drive, but also, and that's where kind of diversity of a leadership team all around comes into play. When I'm hiring people and I have a panel, I want to make sure that those that serve on the panel are really, they don't think like me. They don't think like me. They don't look like me, because there are certain things that I'm looking for in a candidate. And I want to hear the different perspectives that I don't hold. The other thing is we've got to get away from the notion of, when you're hiring for a particular position that, the person that's coming into this social media position is going to look like this. It's not about the person. You've really got to step away, listen to their story, and really think about the value that they're going to bring to the collective team. And that's really the power of diversity and inclusion. It's about the differences and how collectively you can build a more robust team. The other thing that I wanted to mention just about bias is that it shows up in small ways and big ways. And, there are times where there's small things like, hey, maybe someone is passing by you and they're not saying good morning, and it could be very unintentional and you can bring it up to that person. But then there are some things that really connect to the larger sense of not belonging. And another example that I've had in the workplace is I had a male peer once, and I noticed in our leadership team meetings, when other male leaders were talking to him, they could challenge what he was saying, and it was met with approval. So they could challenge each other. There was just a different kind of banter that happened between them. There were times where I challenged or would push back on something that this male leader said, and immediately the body language changed. My feedback was not wanted. I could feel it from either what he said or didn't say, just the look that he gave. And so we really have to be, and in those situations, that's really what leads to the I don't belong. So if you are, and even if you're not a leader, if you're in an organization and you're sitting at the table and you know that no matter what you say, it's going to be met with a certain resistance, over time, you're going to go back and you're going to stop contributing. And that's what companies and leaders don't want. So we have to really be cognizant of both the small and the big ways that we, exhibit that unconscious bias.
Great, thank you.
Catherine, can I add one more thing to that? Brandi reminded me of something. I think the whole concept of fit is, I would caution even the use of that word. I mean, we all use it probably, and we know, what our intention is. But when people, candidates and people who don't feel like they belong to that word fit, that is something that says, I don't fit here, I don't belong. So it immediately disconnects them from the engagement of the interview process, the whatever other process they're in during their employment there or their relationship with that organization. As a leader in various organizations in the city as well, I've experienced the same thing that Brandi mentioned about, you say something, and then someone after you say it exactly the way you said it, or, you know, and you don't see any difference in what they said and what you said, except a couple of things. And so you can, you know, you have that feeling of that my voice doesn't belong here. So I wanted to just share that thought about fit and us to be cautious of how we use that word in different settings.
That's good. I think one of the things that can help with that is instead of focusing on the idea of fit and a person's individual characteristics, to always go back to the company's values. If you have stated values and you've said these are the things that are important to us as an organization, and you put everything back into the context of the values, it's easier to have the conversation about fit without making it about a person. You make it more about the values that are inherent to the company and what's going to really set people up for the most success in that organization. So we'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. Before I do that, I want to take a little bit of a pause here and just to see if there are any questions or additional thoughts, particularly around this topic of belonging, that anyone from our audience wants to throw out. If you have, you know, an example of something that you thought was really helpful, or perhaps you have a question for one of our guests that you want to ask, I'll just take a moment, and Megan, let us know if there's anybody that we want to pull into the conversation here. And I think that's Ellen that's speaking. Ellen, do you want to share your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I do. I'm not willing to be on video today. I just didn't quite prepare appropriately. So I apologize for that, but want to say that this is wonderful. And also, I worked with Brandi at One America, and I found it to be a wonderful experience. So thrilled that, you know, to be able to be with her today. But I'm wanting to share an aspect of diversity and inclusion and a sense of belonging that I experienced, try to be brief. I was in my 50s. I won't say where in the 50s, but I was in my 50s, and I was looking for a new role, and I applied for something that I found that One America was asking for. And I remember thinking, I won't fit there. I won't belong, because what I knew about the company at the time was they're very conservative. They seem to be rather white male dominated. Also, I have gray hair. I am an older woman, and I don't want to pretend otherwise for whatever reason, however that looks to me. I had chosen to stop dyeing my hair and things like that. And I thought, I don't know if they'll, I also have a quirky sense of humor. And so anyway, I thought, I don't know if they'll like me, but this job does sound like a perfect fit. So I'm just going to be who I am, and we'll see what happens. And I was so pleasantly surprised throughout the entire process that by the time, I mean, I was like, yes, I want to work for you. You guys have shocked me and surprised me the whole time. I never thought you'd all be so wonderful. And one of the people is on the line right now, Bree Dunscombe. She was one of the wonderful folk who interviewed me. Anyway, I just wanted to say that that was a sense where I thought maybe I wouldn't feel like I could belong, that the company and I would not match in some way. And I have been very pleasantly surprised to find that's not the case, and that I have actually flourished. And so I guess that's a positive story about one aspect of that from one person. I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah. I believe Peggy I'm sorry, go ahead. I think Peggy, you had your hand up if you'd like to make a comment, ask a question.
Yes. Good morning. This is awesome. It's such a deep issue, you know, when we think about how we're raised. And, you know, I was raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in a very kind of sheltered area, and didn't really know people who weren't like me. And then went to University of Michigan, where I met more people. And then I was fortunate to work in the Detroit area, where I had a much more diverse community of coworkers, and did recruiting there. And I just think of what a gift that was, to be able to meet colleagues. That was back in the 80s too. And I happened to have a male manager who was Black, who sent me to this MBA, or it was minority MBA big event. And he said, you know, I don't believe in only sending minorities to minority events. And it was the biggest gift he could have given me, really. And so meaningful. And I got to tell you, I did not belong. And it was the first time probably that I had that empathy deep within, because I knew, and everyone was warm and lovely. So, you know, imagine that being in a situation where people aren't warm and lovely. So it was just such a gift. But I feel like a lot of these biases come from people who don't have exposure. They don't have opportunities to work with people and form impressions that are outside of what they see on TV, maybe. And this communication is so critical when someone assumes something, you know, like in the example of someone not talking to someone in the morning and maybe assuming the worst, and maybe it's not, maybe it's something totally different. And I hope that we can get to the place that we can kind of confront some of these things, show a lot of grace, and just say, hey, you know, is this, you know, how you are, or is there something I've done?
I think taking the first step and making sure we know it's not just on other people, it's also on each of us individually is really critical, and seeking out those opportunities to initiate and have conversations and go to things like you're talking about, just putting yourself in different environments. All of those things are really helpful. Jen Berry, I see that you have a hand raised too. Did you want to share a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Brandi and Thresette to elaborate on this idea of blind spots. I love that. And I think the idea that these are blind spots, so we can't see them. What are ways you would recommend that we can uncover and discover what these are? Like, I know for me, there are people in my life who I trust and we have that relationship and they can say it, but they don't interact with me in all aspects of my life. So I wondered if you guys had some recommendations.
Well, there are different, I'll start. There are different ways to identify what your blind spots are. And of course, they're called blind spots because you don't know they're there. But one activity I do when I do a workshop called Understanding and Reducing Unconscious Bias is I have everyone in the room look around the room. And the first thought they have about someone that isn't necessarily positive, I ask them to write it down. And then I have them put them all on flip charts across the room. And we go around the room and we talk about the why of it. And so, you know, understanding that, you know, this is, why did I say this? You know, and going through a series of the why question, the conversation about it. Where did it come from? Did I inherit it? Did I watch it on TV? Did I, you know, discovering the source and awareness of that you have it, and then start the process of figuring out, what do I do about it now? I think is a start. It's a long-term process, and this conversation, of course, is just a tip of the iceberg. But that's one exercise that we do, and I try to make sure that everybody in the room understands. To one of the points made earlier, everyone has an unconscious bias. You know, we're not just talking about racism here. We're talking about unconscious biases that we have, that we all have.
And I would share
one way.
I kind of, sorry for interrupting. I want to share one activity I've done that's kind of the flip of spotting those blind spots, but I think can be helpful with really getting your teams on board with valuing those that they're sitting around the table with. And I've done it with a couple of my teams, some of which are have joined us on this Zoom, and it's an easy exercise, but I asked everyone to prepare the night before, get a note card, write down the names of everyone on our team, and what are the top 2-3 things about that person in terms of how they show up that you really appreciate. And when we've come together for our all team meetings, we've gone, and it's kind of like speed dating, you know, like put 60 seconds on the clock and we go around the room. We normally go someplace outside of the building. And people walk away thinking, like I had no idea that people appreciated those things about me. And what's interesting is when you put them all on paper, it's really those small, unique things that make huge contributions to our team. And so the first part is acknowledging that we all are different, that we're all bringing something to the table. But when they hear from their other team members that this is what we really love and value about you, it really changes the dynamics of the team. And so if it's something that you haven't done, I would definitely encourage that you try that exercise.
That's a great idea, Brandi. And actually it just reminds me of, there's an activity called the leadership game that Meg and I have actually facilitated for a leadership team for a client. And it's essentially the same thing. It's got questions and it's put into the types of team. So it's a little bit less confrontational. It doesn't feel like too touchy-feely, but the end result is that you really get to know the others on your team in a way, and start to really appreciate each other for what you're bringing to the table in a way that's just a little bit different from your traditional team meetings or even team building types of exercises. So that kind of stuff really does help to build a lot of trust and opportunity just to connect. So that's really great. So before we go any further,
Is
yeah,
that,
go ahead.
just real quick, I think those are great team activities, and there's so many more I could share. I think when you're with a group of people who don't know each other, though, and that's the situation I'm in a lot of times, you have to do that a little bit differently, because they won't be as forthright when they don't know each other. I think teams tend to be a little more of that, and you can do more deep dives. So just a thought about people who don't know each other, how do you share that as well? And the activity I shared earlier is something that gets them talking.
That's a really great point, Thresette. You have to really think about where you are in the relationship, if there even is a relationship. So I'd like to go a little bit further with that and kind of revisit something that you talked about earlier, Thresette. You know, a lot of the people that are on this call, on this Zoom chat, are in communications positions, they're in leadership positions, maybe they're in HR positions or some sort of maybe consultant to their clients, thinking about culture and thinking about organizational structure. I'm curious how we can really think about this concept of belonging and really make sure that we are incorporating it and building it up in every aspect of the employee experience. And to us, we look at that as obviously a patient's issue, but it of course goes much deeper than that. But how can we use the tool of communications? How can we use the culture that we're building in our organizations to really create that sense of belonging across that entire employee experience, from the very first time they even see a job posting, perhaps, all the way through, you know, their time in the company, even to that exit interview, that exiting the company and moving on to some other opportunity. So Thresette, you want to start with that, and then we'll go to Brandi?
Sure. I think that one of the things that's really important when we start looking at creating things across our culture is to make sure that we get a baseline of where our organization is. I mean, many organizations struggle with this whole diversity, inclusion, and now belonging piece, which, as I said, I think actually needs to come first, because when you meet that human need, you get a lot more commitment on the other two. But one of the things that's important is understanding where they are. What are the gaps and what are the pains they're having in this whole area of D&I and belonging? So you can be sure you're working on the right things. So that's first, and that's getting the leadership and key people aligned around that. In addition to that, I think that it's important to understand that belonging is the driver of employee engagement. It's a huge motivator and a huge driver of employee engagement. So you've got to create systems that are flexible enough to recognize and reward each person for their accomplishments and their contributions. And, you know, we can't base our company culture, we talked about values earlier, and I think those are absolutely necessary. They've got to be flexible enough to appreciate different cultures and other things that they might have as value, and talk about that even sometimes before setting them. Understand the demographic you have. And you don't want to, we don't want to say that we are not going to have our own values, but we do have to consider who we have there and what their values are as well. So create systems that give the different thoughts and perspectives and opinions of others who are unlike us. The second thing I would say is create a team environment where everybody can contribute to generating that belonging culture. You know, because I encourage every leader to have a belonging strategy. I had a leader years ago, a boss who challenged me to think about why I felt I didn't belong. You know, and I really appreciate her for that. She's one of my best bosses. She challenged me to think about my part in this. It's a 50-50 type thing. We've got to invest in our own belonging as well. So create an environment where you can help generate that culture. And when people are successful in their journey, they can share that, somehow capture it in writing, a book, feature it on social media, newsletter, wherever. So it encourages other people who may be having a similar struggle. One other thing is that, you know, if you don't feel you belong, you won't engage and speak up. If people don't feel that they can speak up, their voice won't be heard. And if their voice isn't heard, they won't have opportunities for higher performance. So there's got to be a commitment to diversity and inclusion being part of that whole equation. And people as leaders need to get training. This is something that may not be popular to say, but it's definitely true. And I believe it wholeheartedly. Race is a social construct. We have to shift our mindset to understand that we're all part of the same human race. And when we recognize this, it's hard not to recognize that we are all equal. And so a lot of this will be easier. So I think that those are the types of things we have to start with. But first, that baseline. Things I said are other things that can be leveraged to maximize the impact you have in this area of diversity, inclusion, and belonging.
Great, thank you. Brandi, would you like to add any other thoughts about just that entire spectrum of the employee experience and how we can really achieve the belonging?
Yeah, I think that our companies need to be as intentional with their employee experiences as we are in this day and age with our customer experiences. And so, you know, when I think of the work that, you know, my marketing communication team does day in and day out, it's all about customizing the experience for our network of teachers and administrators in schools, and they're all different. And so we don't tailor our communications just one way. We want them to be able to see and feel their voice within what we're sending to them. And so why aren't we doing that with our employees as well? You know, employees want experiences that are going to support, connect them, and empower them. And there's a number of ways that you can do this. You can invest in growth and development. I mean, Peggy's example earlier was a great one of her, you know, being sent to a Black MBA event. Mentorship programs, I know for me personally, have been a great opportunity, and it's something where, you know, it's something that everyone from literally top down benefit from. And so as a leader, when you have the opportunity to spend more intentional time with members across your organization, because you have so many blind spots, you have a better understanding of what their experience is, and it might be at a layer that you don't have visibility to every day. You know, when I think through some of the all of the mentors that I've had in a professional setting, they have all been white males. And you know, I've had some incredible mentors, and I would say that I have learned so much from them, and they have learned so much from me. And so those were experiences that truly have been invaluable to me. We have to continue to promote diversity. And so, you know, there are some opportunities that you see more companies doing more of, whether it's Pride Month, Black History Month. It's interesting, just a couple of weeks ago, seeing the change of how many people were talking about Juneteenth. And I was sitting there reflecting, for the first time in my professional career, I told my employer why I was taking PTO on Juneteenth. And I had to kind of, within myself, challenge myself and saying, why was I not, you know, why didn't I share that with my teams before? It's something that, you know, my family participates in. We have our own personal celebration, but then that also connects back to that belonging piece of why wasn't I comfortable sharing internally, like, hey, I'm not here on, you know, this day because of this. And ultimately, we just need to be an ally. We truly have to wrap ourselves around the benefits, and this, I think this has been shared a number of times. When your team members fully feel like they belong, you're going to see higher engagement rates. Your team members will be engaged and invested in your organization. Your talent brand is going to speak for itself. I've seen so many companies that like, what can we do to improve our brand? Your number one, marketing tool are your team members. They're walking ambassadors, and you can't mask that. They're going to leave work and they're going to go home, tell their friends and family about their experience. And so there's so many things that you can do, but I think it's really about starting small. Like you can't boil the ocean, but if I would really say, and this is what we're doing at Project Lead the Way right now, I think a lot of companies have taken a look at the current climate and said, what do we need to do differently? And I would say that there's few that don't need to do anything differently. There's so many strides that we can all make. And we've started with just conversations with our team members. So instead of pushing out a whole bunch of new initiatives, we've just sat down and we're individually having conversations and saying, tell me about your experience here at Project Lead the Way. And it really starts there with that conversation.
Great, thank you, Brandi. Okay, so I want to again just open it up for any questions that anyone wants to share. So if you want to put something in the chat or do a hand raise. And while we're waiting for that, I also wanted just to mention that we have put a few resources into the chat that we have done, and we'll send these out in a follow-up email as well. There are some great things online. There are some great books. So we've shared a few of those, and I think some of you have also shared a few items. That's really helpful and really great. There's so many things that we're seeing out there today, and a lot of it's very good, but I know it's difficult to sometimes kind of weed through and figure out what the right thing is. So hopefully some of the things that we're providing will be helpful to you. So in the meantime then, does anyone have a question, or do we have any other comments that anyone wants to throw out?
I think I would just say one more thing. When we're making a case for belonging, and this has been the case for diversity and inclusion for years, we have to tie that to the bottom line of the organization. And I think that's easily done with some of the things we talked about. But we've got to make that direct connection to what it's worth to the organization, and what it's worth to the employees, and what it's worth to the customers and the people in the community that support the company or the organization. So that's always a challenge. Make that dollar connection. Challenge and an opportunity.
Definitely. All right, any other thoughts that anyone wants to share?
Catherine, we did have one question come in earlier about belonging that Alyssa sent along, and I think part of it might have been answered, but I just want to make sure we get it asked here. So she was wondering, are there specific things that people can do to make people feel that belonging feeling? And also, what can people do who are hiring in the hiring position? What can they do to extend an invitation on to people who are different than themselves?
All right, ladies, one of you want to tackle that?
So the first question was, I'll let Brandi go ahead since I just spoke. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was originally I was connecting with kind of the second part of the question of kind of what can we do differently to, I mean, it's all about kind of, the saying of fishing in different ponds. And so it's easy for, I have friends that send me their resumes and saying, hey, I'm looking for something. I could easily send it to my network. A lot of people in my network look and think a lot like me. And so it's really, and as employers, we have to challenge ourselves to look outside of the normal ways and places that we would go to find talent. And it's, but then again, if your organization is currently built in a way and you have that diversity around the table, and you tell your team, hey, we're looking for XYZ candidate, they're all going to be looking in different places because you have intentionally built a team that is diverse and has a number of places where they can pull for that future talent pool. So, I mean, it's again, another benefit of why this is so important.
And I think I'll take the first part of that. What are some of the ways you can help a person feel they belong? I think it's important to help provide access for them to opportunities and events and things that will help them feel like they belong by putting them in situations where they can, and be that support for them. I mean, kind of come alongside them as that ally, that support, that mentor whatever it is that they need to really support them in that effort on their belonging journey. I know that happened to me. I was kind of like Peggy. I got sent to some things. I think it was Peggy that said she had the MBA experience, but I was able to get involved in things where, it was just me. Now, since the 6th grade, I had been integrated. So it was kind of not new to me, but it was a different experience and a different environment where I had to think differently. So providing access, support, and opportunity to someone, being aware that someone may not feel like they belong by looking at body language, looking at their interactions, engage them in conversation, ask them their opinion, all those different things that we may not do. We may think, why don't they speak up? Well, if their voice isn't being heard or they don't feel like they belong, they probably won't. So those are some things. There's many more, but those are just a few that have had a real impact in some of the situations I've helped with leaders across global leaders, as well as in my own personal experience.
Great, thank you, Thresette. So as we wrap up, I just want to throw it to my team to see if we've forgotten anything, if there are any questions left in the chat that I didn't see, or Meg, if there are any additional thoughts that we want to add to the conversation before we close up.
Yeah, I did just see a question pop up from Peggy in the chat, and Peggy asks, what do you think the right way is to do ERGs, employee resource groups, and how do we create spaces that allow for people to have interaction in safe spaces that don't include others relative to those ERGs?
I personally think ERGs are so important, and when done right, and when I say and done right, it's a great opportunity within those employee resource groups for people to really have their voices heard. And you're surrounding yourself with maybe those who've had the same experience, but the flip side is making sure that those groups aren't completely closed, because there is a huge learning opportunity for members of your teams to come in and hear about the experiences that might be happening within the workplace or outside of the workplace from those that are very different from them. And those are invaluable experiences. We didn't touch upon ERGs, I think, really at all during this time, but I think that they're definitely critical and an important tool.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Brandi. I've seen some of our clients who have very well-established ERGs really use those well from a business perspective too. You have this wealth of knowledge and wealth of experiences within your own organization, and when you can put that to work, not only to make the employee experience better, but also to test ideas for the marketplace. Those are so valuable, and it really, I think, does even more to create a sense of belonging for those employees, because they know, well, this isn't just a club for us to get together like-minded people. This is an opportunity for us to actually provide our company with some valuable insights about a critical part of the consumer marketplace.
Yeah, and when you go back to the question that you asked me earlier in terms of how do you create more intentional experiences, I mean, there's no better place than to go to those ERGs and let them also thought partner on what, how can we improve the experience here at this company? And what are the things that we're not acknowledging? What can we do better? I mean, that's a perfect place to start with those conversations.
And I would only add to that I'm a fan of employee resource groups as well, sometimes called affinity groups. But I think it's important to start the foundation well and make sure that everybody understands what's the intended outcome and what the results need to be, because I've seen them go horribly wrong. So it makes sense, definitely, to make sure that everybody understands ground rules, expectations, and what they invest in making that group work. But I'm definitely a fan. They can be very productive when used well.
Thank you. Okay, well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. We have just a few minutes left, so if anyone has any final thoughts or questions and want to throw that out. In the meantime, I'll just let everyone know that we have been recording today's session, and we will be sharing back a link to the recording with you in case you feel like it would be helpful to go back and listen, or if you want to share this with other members of your team. We'll also put this on our website, and you can certainly find it there. And we'll be putting together a summary type of a blog so that you can kind of get the main points from today's time on our website as well. And we post those in the Borshoff social channels. So if you want to follow us, you can see that there as well. Let's see. I also wanted to share with you all that our next Shoff Chat is going to be on July 22nd. And the topic there is, well, our guest speaker will be Stephanie Joranson. She's the communications director at Medtronic, which is a major medical device company here in the US. And the registration details for that will be up in our social channels fairly soon. The actual topic we're going to discuss with Stephanie is internal content strategy. And I think this will just be a really great conversation to talk more about how we can add value and really develop strategies that make sense for our internal content for employees. I believe Medtronic has about 90,000 employees across the globe. So I think Stephanie will have all kinds of interesting things to share with us. Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining with us today. I feel like we just barely scraped the surface of this topic and we could talk for hours. So hopefully some of the resources will be helpful to you, and you can continue to have this conversation in your own organizations. Thank you, Brandi. Thank you, Thresette. We really appreciate you guys joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Bye-bye.